From her friendly, kind, innocent smile during the day to her evil tendencies that hid in the dark. This is the case of a notorious nun whose reign terrorized Greece in the mid-20th century. Keratea, Greece. A woman named Mariam Soulakiotis, also known as Mariam of Keratea or Mother Rasputin, rose to notoriety for all the wrong reasons. She wasn't a typical nun. Instead of spreading kindness and faith, she was accused of committing heinous crimes. Mariam was an abbess, which means she was in charge of a convent. But instead of leading a life of piety and devotion, she allegedly committed acts of murder, fraud, and other crimes against the people in her care. Imagine a place of worship turned into a house of horrors. That's what Mariam's abbey reportedly became. She was accused of preying on both regular people and her fellow nuns, using her position of authority to commit unspeakable acts. The media labeled her Mother Rasputin, drawing parallels to the infamous Russian mystic and advisor to the Romanovs, known for his controversial influence. Mariam's alleged crimes shocked Greece, with prosecutors accusing her of being responsible for the deaths of as many as 500 people. But how did this supposed woman of God become a serial killer? Let's find out. Before Mariam Soulakiotis became a notorious figure, she led a mysterious life. Born Marina in 1883 in Keratea, Greece, she started off as a factory worker. Not much is known about her early years, but eventually, she entered the Orthodox Church as a nun. Initially, Mariam followed the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church, but things took a turn when the church switched to a new calendar in 1923. Mariam didn't agree with this change and became an old calendarist, following Bishop Matthew Karpathakis of Vresthina, who was seen as being in opposition to the mainstream church. Mariam, now known as Mother Mariam of Keratea, alongside Bishop Matthew, founded the Panagia Pefkovounogiatrissa Monastery in 1927. This monastery wasn't just a place of worship, it was also a financial support for the old calendarist movement. But here's where things got murky. Despite being a nun, Mariam seemed to have a knack for acquiring wealth. She purchased acres of land to expand the monastery, but there's no clear explanation of where all this money came from. Even historians can't pin down the source of these funds. Some speculate that Mariam's close ties with Bishop Matthew might have played a role in the monastery's financial dealings. But regardless of the source, it was clear that Mariam was deeply involved in building up the monastery's assets. As investigators looked into Mariam's past, they found a trail of questionable decisions and financial transactions. How did a former factory worker turned nun amass such wealth? And what role did Bishop Matthew play in all of this? The monastery where Mariam Soulakiotis was in charge had a fancy Greek name, but in English, it's roughly translated as the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines. It was built high up in the mountains, supposedly to help people with tuberculosis because the air was thought to be good for them. Even though Mariam officially became the abbess in 1950, she'd been running the show since 1939. Her partner in crime, Archbishop Matthew, left all the daily work to her while he focused on his own spiritual pursuits, like fasting for long periods and wearing heavy chains. So, while the outside world might have seen the monastery as a place of healing, inside, Mariam was allegedly up to some shady stuff. With her in charge, it seemed like the monastery wasn't just a place of worship, it was a front for something much darker. As World War II raged on, Bishop Matthew's health took a nosedive. This made him rely even more on Mariam Soulakiotis, giving her even more power over the monastery. By 1950, Bishop Matthew was seriously ill, and Mariam's influence over him reached new heights. But Mariam's grip on power didn't just stop there. She allegedly went to extreme lengths to control the situation, even when Bishop Matthew was on his deathbed. There's a chilling tale where she supposedly stopped him from reconciling with another bishop, Metropolitan Chrysostomos, who he was at odds with. As Bishop Matthew tried to speak with the other bishop, Mariam barged in with her nuns and demanded the visitors leave immediately. Just a few days later, Bishop Matthew passed away, leaving Mariam to take over as the head of the monastery. During this time, she adopted an even stricter appearance, wearing a headdress that completely covered her forehead and eyebrows, signaling her authority over the nuns. With Bishop Matthew out of the picture, Mariam's rule over the monastery seemed absolute. As I've mentioned, Mariam Soulakiotis wasn't any typical abbess. Instead of leading a life of devotion, she allegedly used her position to carry out a chilling scheme. Her supposed plan was to lure wealthy women into joining her convent, where she would then torture them until they handed over their fortunes. Once she got the money, she'd allegedly pocket it for herself and, in some cases, even kill the donor. Starting in 1940, Mariam reportedly took control of the nuns in her convent and sent the monastery's monks on a hunt for wealthy women across Greece to convert and exploit. By the time she was arrested, she had allegedly amassed hundreds of properties, along with gold and jewels worth a fortune. Mariam's crimes first came to light when the daughter of a wealthy woman complained to the police, claiming her mother wouldn't have willed all her property to the monastery willingly. She accused Mariam of blackmail and threats. Another incident that raised suspicion was the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman from Ohio who was traced to the monastery by the FBI. Her father accused Mariam of luring his daughter there to collect her inheritance. But Mariam's alleged misdeeds didn't stop there. Prosecutors claimed that her strict rules led to the unnecessary deaths of 150 people seeking treatment for tuberculosis at the monastery. They alleged that doctors were only allowed on-site to sign death certificates, not to provide proper medical care. Survivors of Mariam's regime accused her of torture, starvation, false imprisonment, and physical abuse. It seemed like Mariam ruled her monastery with an iron fist, using fear and manipulation to maintain control. In a dramatic raid on December 4th, 1950, more than 85 police officers stormed the monastery where Mariam Soulakiotis ruled, accompanied by legal officials. The scene was chaotic as they rescued 36 children from the nuns' grasp, transferring them to orphanages. They also found elderly women tied up in the basement, malnourished and sick, shocking evidence of neglect. As investigations deepened, prosecutors initially faced challenges in building a case against Mariam. They began with charges related to minor offenses like illegally exporting olive oil and importing tires. However, as more evidence surfaced, the charges against Mariam and her accomplices became more serious, including homicide, fraud, forgery, blackmail, and torture. The legal battle intensified when Archbishop Spiridon Vlachos of Athens failed to reconcile with another bishop, leading to the outlawing of all Old Calendarist sects in Greece, including the one Mariam belonged to. The public prosecutor then indicted Mariam, along with 13 others, on a slew of serious charges. During her trials, Mariam defiantly wore an Orthodox icon depicting Bishop Matthew, whom she honored as a saint, despite the accusations against her. Her defense attorney argued that it was customary for people joining monasteries to surrender their belongings, claiming that Mariam's possession of the properties was merely a technicality. In a surprising twist, Mariam's defense presented a letter supposedly from Field Marshal Harold Alexander, praising the monastery's clergy for aiding British soldiers during World War II. This attempt to portray Mariam and her monastery in a positive light was met with skepticism by the prosecution. Despite the defense's efforts, the mounting evidence against Mariam painted a damning picture of her crimes. The courtroom drama captivated the nation as Mariam's fate hung in the balance. Mariam Soulakiotis wasn't just accused of financial crimes. She was also convicted of several murders. Among her victims were the Baca family, who joined the monastery but wanted to leave when they realized the truth about its conditions. Mariam, unwilling to let go of their wealth, kept Mrs. Baca confined in a cell for 6 months until she died, while Mr. Baca suffered the same fate. Another couple, the Panagiotopoulos, signed over their home to Mariam but ended up starving to death in the monastery. Ms. Soulakiotis sought treatment for tuberculosis at the monastery, but received none and died in a cell after signing over her property. Sister Theodote faced a brutal beating as punishment for alleged misconduct, resulting in her death from internal injuries. Sister Maria suffered a similar fate, dying in the hospital after a severe beating. Throughout her trials, Mariam vehemently denied the charges, dismissing them as lies. However, she was convicted and sentenced to a total of 40 years in prison across 3 separate trials. Despite the severity of her crimes, Mariam showed little remorse, only offering a prayer for vengeance to Saint Matthew as she accepted her sentences. These verdicts brought some closure to the families of Mariam's victims, but questions remained about the true extent of her crimes and whether justice had truly been served. Mariam Soulakiotis didn't just lead a convent. She led what some described as a cult. At its peak, she had over 400 devoted followers living in the monastery. What's more, hundreds of people left their entire estates to the monastery and later died there, which raised eyebrows. When Mariam was arrested in 1951, her followers were outraged. They marched in protest, demanding her release, and even planned to kidnap a bishop to use as leverage. Despite her incarceration, her sect continued to operate underground. Mariam's death in 1954 didn't put an end to the mystery. Her sect persisted, with reports of young girls disappearing into thin air, believed to be linked to the rebel convent in Keratea. Police struggled to track down the new leader of the monastery, who seemed to vanish without a trace. Even today, the monastery she once ruled remains open, with some members still believing in her innocence and even venerating her as a saint. Despite being outlawed initially, Old Calendarism, the religious movement Mariam was part of, is no longer considered illegal in Greece. The true extent of Mariam Soulakiotis' crimes remains a subject of debate. During her trial, medical experts testified to 27 murders and 150 negligent homicides from tuberculosis. However, authorities at one point claimed she might have killed over 500 people. It's uncertain how much she was truly involved in these deaths, especially considering the challenges of tuberculosis treatment at the time. Some modern writers, like the priest Constantine Kouris, argue that Mariam was innocent and unfairly judged. Even today, the nuns at the monastery she once ruled continue to pray for her, believing she was martyred for her faith. Others suggest that Mariam was framed by jealous male bishops and monks who coveted her power and wealth. They also argue that many of the deaths at the monastery were simply due to the age of those who joined. Interestingly, Mariam's use of the old Julian calendar rather than the revised one might have been purely coincidental. Some believe she would have been just as successful regardless of her religious affiliation. Additionally, some critics speculate that sensationalized media coverage of Mariam's crimes served as a distraction from political turmoil at the time. In academic circles, there's still disagreement about the number of Mariam's victims. While some argue that the prosecution established at least 177 victims, others question the reliability of such claims. The legacy of Mariam Soulakiotis is undoubtedly one of ambiguity and intrigue. Was she a ruthless serial killer or an innocent victim of circumstance? The truth may never be fully known, leaving behind a dark chapter in the history of Greek crime. Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.